I still remember the smell of antiseptic that morning, the hum of machines, the muted rhythm of the ICU hallway just beginning to stir. It was 2014, St. Mary's Neurosurgical Center in Boston, a place where precision was everything and uncertainty had no place to hide. I'd been an anesthesiologist for 12 years, long enough to know that most surgeries aren't stories, they're routines. You arrive, you prepare, you execute. But that day became something else entirely. Her name was Laura Bennett, 36 years old, a school teacher, mother of two. She came in for what should have been a routine tumor resection. Non-invasive, high survival rate, straightforward. I reviewed her vitals, calm and confident. My team moved with the synchronized grace you only get from repetition. Scrub nurse checking instruments, surgeon humming softly under his breath, monitors beeping in their predictable rhythm. Everything about it was ordinary, familiar, safe. Laura went under at 8:12 a.m. I administered the anesthesia carefully, layer by layer, propofol, sevoflurane, fentanyl, until her eyelids stilled, her breathing slowed, and her consciousness receded into that carefully controlled void we call sleep. Her EEG monitor showed exactly what it should have. Smooth, deep waveforms, the unmistakable quiet of a silent brain. But an hour into the operation, that silence broke. It began subtly, tiny spikes on the EEG, little bursts of activity that shouldn't have existed. At first, I thought it was artifact noise, a loose electrode, maybe static interference. I adjusted the leads, no change. The spikes became rhythmic, too organized to be random. And then something impossible happened. The peaks began to correspond to our voices. Every time someone in the OR spoke, her brainwaves responded, as if she were listening. I froze. I remember my hand tightening around the syringe I was holding, my eyes flicking to the monitors again and again, searching for an explanation. Her heart rate rose slightly when the surgeon said her name. When I asked for the suction, it steadied. When the scrub nurse made a quiet joke, it spiked again. It was like she was there. Check the lines, I muttered. Maybe a grounding issue. We replaced the EEG monitor, then the electrodes. We even switched machines entirely. But no matter what we did, the pattern persisted. The data was clean. The signals were real. I looked at Laura's face, still, serene, untouched by the chaos in my chest. Her pupils didn't react. Her vitals were stable. She was, by every measurable definition, unconscious. Yet something beneath the surface seemed to flicker, like a faint light trapped behind a closed door. The surgeon noticed the tension. "Everything all right, James?" he asked. I hesitated. "Yeah, just a monitor issue." "Keep going." But it wasn't all right. For the first time in my career, I realized we might be operating on a body that wasn't entirely asleep. The thought clawed at me, quiet but relentless. Every sound we made, every word spoken, it all seemed to echo inside that unresponsive frame. The rest of the procedure went perfectly. No complications, no bleeding, no drops in pressure. From the outside, it was the kind of case that would make an intern proud. But as I cleaned my hands afterward, I couldn't shake it. The sense that I had just witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see. Medicine teaches us to trust the data, but only when it makes sense. That morning it didn't, and for the first time in my life, the sterile, bright-lit sanctuary of the operating room felt wrong. I didn't know it then, but that quiet anomaly on a flickering screen was only the beginning. Laura Bennett recovered faster than most. By the next morning, she was alert, responsive, and remarkably calm for someone who had undergone major brain surgery. I remember walking into her recovery room, clipboard in hand, rehearsing the usual post-op questions, pain level, nausea, dizziness. The morning sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, catching the edge of her IV stand and throwing a soft shadow across her face. She looked pale but peaceful. "Good morning, Laura," I said. "You did great yesterday. How are you feeling?" She blinked slowly, her voice faint. "I heard everything you said in that room." I paused, not understanding at first. "Everything?" Her eyes locked on mine, and something about the steadiness of her gaze sent a cold ripple through me. "During the surgery," she said, "you were talking about the song on the radio. The nurse dropped an instrument. Someone said my blood pressure was falling." I didn't breathe for a few seconds. Those were exact details that no one could have known unless they'd been awake. But she hadn't been. Her EEG had been silent, her vitals stable, her body immobile. At first, I thought she might be misremembering fragments from before she went under, or maybe after she woke up. It happens sometimes. Patients confuse dream imagery with reality. But as she continued, it became clear that she remembered everything. The surgeon's sigh, the sound of the monitor, even a brief comment I made under my breath when her pulse rose slightly. The room felt smaller as she spoke. I forced myself to stay calm, to sound rational. "That's highly unusual," I said. "You shouldn't have been able to hear anything. You were completely unconscious." Her expression didn't change. "Then why do I remember?" That question hung between us like a weight. I checked her chart again later, just to reassure myself. Anesthetic depth logs confirmed it. She had been fully under, not a single spike in response levels after induction. No awareness, no movement, no pain. On paper, she was as deeply anesthetized as a person could be, but her memory said otherwise. Over the next few days, Laura's demeanor shifted. She wasn't panicked or delusional. She was lucid, grounded, but detached, like someone who had glimpsed something just out of reach and couldn't unsee it. The nurses noticed too. They whispered about how she sometimes froze mid-sentence, staring off as if listening to something we couldn't hear. I brought up the case at our next staff meeting. Most dismissed it immediately. Anesthetic awareness, suggestibility, false memory reconstruction. But those explanations didn't fit the data. She hadn't shown any of the physiological markers that accompany partial awareness. I remember saying quietly to a colleague afterward, "We train our whole lives to control consciousness, to quiet it. But what if consciousness isn't something you can silence?" That night, when I lay awake in my apartment, the beeping of my alarm clock somehow sounded like the monitor from the OR. I couldn't stop hearing it, and I couldn't stop wondering if Laura ever truly slept at all. I couldn't leave it alone. A week after Laura's discharge, I found myself back in the hospital long after my shift had ended. The corridors were empty, the hum of the ventilation echoing faintly through the sterile halls. I walked toward the neuro lab, carrying a flash drive with the EEG data from her surgery. I told myself it was professional curiosity, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was obsession. I loaded the recording onto the monitor. The first few minutes were unremarkable. Standard delta waves, deep sedation, the slow rhythmic pulse of a patient completely unconscious. But then, around the 40-minute mark, I saw it, a sharp spike. Then another. Then a series of organized waveforms, patterns that shouldn't exist under general anesthesia. They were clean, structured, rhythmic, almost intentional. I froze, staring at the lines dancing across the screen. Each time someone in the OR had spoken during surgery, Laura's brain had responded. When the surgeon gave an instruction, when a nurse whispered something, even when I adjusted her dosage, her neural activity pulsed, synchronized perfectly with our voices. It wasn't noise. It was recognition. I pulled out the surgical log and matched timestamps. Every burst of activity corresponded with a moment of human speech. It was as if her brain heard us. For hours, I sat in that room replaying it, trying to explain it away. Maybe a glitch in the EEG feed. Maybe interference from another monitor. But every test I ran came back clean. The signal was pure. The next morning, I brought the findings to one of our neurologists, Dr. Patel. He studied the graphs quietly for several minutes, his brow furrowing. "Could be artifact," he said, not looking up. "Muscle interference, electrical noise. Sometimes these things happen." "Artifact doesn't form coherent language patterns," I replied. "Look at this. It aligns exactly with our speech." He leaned back, sighed, and finally said, "I've seen something like this once before. A case in Chicago. The patient showed organized neural activity during a coma. Everyone dismissed it as random firing. But," he trailed off, shaking his head, "some of us think maybe consciousness doesn't shut down. Maybe it just hides." That word, hides, echoed in my head for days. When I brought it to administration, they warned me to stop pursuing it. "You'll scare people," one of the board members said. "Do you want the hospital's name associated with pseudoscience?" But I couldn't stop thinking about Laura, about how she looked at me when she said she'd heard everything. I started noticing little things after that. The way the EEG machine seemed to flicker when the OR went quiet. The way the monitors would pulse faintly when no one was touching them. Once, while reviewing data alone, I swore I heard the faintest sound. A voice? Or maybe just air through the vents, whispering a word I couldn't quite catch. That night, I wrote in my notes, "We don't silence the mind. We silence the body. The mind waits." I stared at those words for a long time, the hospital dark around me, and realized I was afraid, not of what I'd found, but of what it meant. Because if the mind remains awake, even when the body cannot move, then what exactly are we putting to sleep? It was nearly 3 weeks later when Laura called me. I remember the hour, just past midnight. I almost didn't answer, but something in my chest told me I should. Her voice was trembling. "Dr. Whitaker, it's happening again." I sat up instantly. "What's happening, Laura?" She hesitated. "The sounds. From the operating room." At first I thought she meant nightmares, a post-anesthetic hallucination. But she continued, her tone brittle, panicked. "It's not dreams. It's replaying. Every night when I try to sleep, I hear everything. The beeping, the suction, your voice. Even the song that was playing. My blood ran cold. That same soft piano track we played to keep the OR calm. She couldn't possibly have remembered that. I told her to come in for an evaluation. The next morning, she sat across from me in the small, sterile consultation room. She looked pale, exhausted, as if she hadn't truly slept in days. "I hear it when it's quiet," she said, staring past me. "It starts faint, like a hum. Then it builds. The machines, the voices. It's like the room's still alive somewhere, looping forever." I tried to keep my tone steady. "Laura, sometimes the brain stores sensory impressions in ways we don't fully understand. It could be trauma, or..." She cut me off sharply. "Then why does it respond?" I frowned. "Respond?" She took out her phone and played an audio recording. A faint, distorted beeping came through the speaker, identical to the pulse ox monitor from our operating room. She whispered, "Last night I asked it to stop, and it did." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. That afternoon, I ran her vitals. Everything was normal. But as I placed the pulse oximeter on her finger, the device flickered. It gave a brief tone, just one sharp beep, perfectly in rhythm with the one from her recording. Then, silence. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed faintly. Then, almost imperceptibly, the lights dimmed and brightened again. Power fluctuation, I told myself. A coincidence. But the way she looked at me said she didn't believe that. Later, as I left the exam room, I checked my pocket and noticed something odd. My portable pulse oximeter, one I'd carried since residency, was still powered on. I hadn't touched it all day. Yet it was beeping, slow and steady. The same rhythm as that night in the OR. I stood there in the hallway, surrounded by the muted buzz of hospital machinery, and realized I was shaking. That evening, I wrote in my journal, "She hears the room. The sound responds. What are we carrying from one consciousness to another?" The next day, Laura didn't return my calls. But she left a voicemail before disappearing for a week. Her voice was calm, almost detached. "I don't think I ever really came back," she said. "I think part of me is still there, with you." I played that message over and over, and for the first time in my career, I didn't want to go back to the hospital, because deep down, I knew what she meant. I tried to move on. I told myself what every doctor tells themselves after an inexplicable case. Document, debrief, and forget. But I couldn't. Every time I stepped into the operating room, I found myself listening for something beyond the machinery, for that faint, impossible rhythm. I began noticing things I had previously ignored. Slight fluctuations in brain activity right before sedation. The way a patient's vitals would sometimes sync with the background music or a voice. Once you've seen a pattern, you can't unsee it. I knew I needed to understand what happened to Laura, not for the hospital, not even for science, for me. So I began an experiment, quietly. During my next few anesthetic inductions, I spoke a simple phrase, just before my patients went under, "We'll see you on the other side." It was a harmless statement, chosen for its neutrality. I wanted to test whether any fragment of it would resurface later. Days later, when one patient, a middle-aged man recovering from abdominal surgery, was coming out of anesthesia, he mumbled through the fog of consciousness. "Other side? Yeah, I heard you." I froze. At first, I convinced myself it was coincidence. The mind can piece together suggestions from the environment, from hearing similar phrases post-op. But I couldn't ignore it. So, on the next case, I changed the phrase to something unique, something no one else would say. "The ocean is quiet tonight." 3 days later, during a post-operative checkup, the patient, a young woman, asked me suddenly, "Why did you talk about the ocean?" I felt the air leave my lungs. She didn't know why she said it. She said it came to her in a dream while she was unconscious. That's when I realized Laura might not have been an isolated case. Something was breaking through. Something about anesthesia, the veil we trusted to silence consciousness, wasn't as complete as we thought. In the weeks that followed, I expanded my test quietly, using subtle cues, melodies, numbers, single words. The results were inconsistent, but enough came back to convince me this wasn't coincidence. A fragment of awareness persisted, submerged but awake, and yet there was another pattern, one that terrified me. During these experiments, I noticed intermittent spikes on the EEG monitors, small bursts of activity that shouldn't exist under surgical depth. They looked identical to Laura's, the same flickering signature. At first, I dismissed them as noise, but then, during one procedure, while reviewing the data, I heard something faint, a whisper on the audio track of the OR recording. It was my own voice, repeating the phrase I had said hours earlier, but it wasn't an echo. It was offbeat, delayed by seconds, like something was saying it back. I shut the monitor off and sat in the dark for a long time. The deeper I went into the data, the more it felt like looking into a mirror that didn't quite reflect you back correctly. That night, as I left the hospital, the automatic doors opened on their own before I reached them. I remember the air outside felt too cold for spring. I told myself I was tired. Just tired, but part of me, quietly, deeply, knew that I had opened something I wasn't supposed to. Word spreads fast in hospitals. Rumors move through hallways faster than infection. It wasn't long before my quiet experiments drew attention. A surgical nurse mentioned to a colleague that I'd been testing consciousness. A resident overheard a recovery nurse asking why I whispered phrases before induction. Within weeks, I was summoned to a private meeting with the ethics board. They were polite, clinical, concerned more for liability than for truth. They told me my actions compromised protocol, that I'd blurred the line between observation and interference. I wanted to argue that what I'd found could change our entire understanding of the brain under anesthesia, but I could see it in their eyes. They didn't want discovery. They wanted control. The board shut everything down. My access to EEG archives was revoked. My private notes confiscated. They made me sign a statement acknowledging I'd conducted unauthorized cognitive tests, and that no anomalous results were verified. But how do you unsee what you've seen? After that, the operating room felt different, colder. Every beep of the monitor sounded heavier, slower, as if it was watching me. Sometimes, when the OR was empty, I'd stand at the head of the surgical bed and listen to the silence, the same silence I'd once trusted with my life. And then came the night that ended everything. It was just past 2 a.m., an emergency craniotomy. A young man in his 20s, motorcycle accident. Severe intracranial bleed, no time to hesitate. We moved fast, airway secured, lines placed, vitals steady. For a while, it was textbook. Then the lights flickered. At first, I thought it was a power surge. The backup generator sometimes caused that. But when they stabilized, I looked at the EEG. My stomach turned cold. The same pattern. The same impossible waveforms I'd seen with Laura. The surgical team noticed the tension in my face. The lead neurosurgeon asked, "Everything okay, James?" Before I could answer, it happened. Through the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator, through the hum of machines and whispered commands, came a single sound, the patient's voice, faint, mechanical, filtered through the breathing tube, but unmistakable. One word, "Stop." Every hand in the room froze. No one spoke. The heart monitor continued its steady pulse, utterly normal, but the silence that followed felt wrong, heavy. The scrub nurse looked at me like I'd conjured it. The surgeon whispered, "Did he just—" I shook my head. "He's under. He can't." But he had. The rest of the operation continued in silence. Not a single word more than necessary. When it ended, we all stood there longer than usual, waiting for something, another sound, another sign. But nothing came. Later in post-op, I checked the recordings. The voice was there. Faint, but real. The waveform matched no one in the room. The sound tech reviewed it twice and finally said, "Whatever that was, it didn't come from any of our mics. That was the last surgery I ever performed." Because that night, I realized something I'd been too afraid to admit. It's been 9 years since that night. I haven't stepped foot inside an operating room since. The world outside the hospital feels quieter now, simpler. But that silence is deceptive. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint rhythm of monitors echoing in my mind, the soft hiss of ventilators, the distant hum of a world between sleep and death. My name is Dr. James Whitaker. I was an anesthesiologist for nearly 2 decades, and I used to think I understood what it meant to make someone sleep. I believed in the science, the protocols, the clean edges of medicine. I thought consciousness was a switch, a system we could control, manage, and measure. But what I saw, what I heard, changed that forever. After I resigned, I kept one thing from my office, an old EEG monitor. It sits on a shelf behind me now, dark and silent. Some nights, I swear I see a flicker of green across its screen, a phantom signal that disappears when I turn to look. Maybe it's nothing, or maybe it's the echo of something I never truly silenced. I've replayed that last surgery in my mind countless times, the lights flickering, the patient's voice breaking the impossible barrier between anesthesia and awareness. "Stop!" It wasn't a command. It felt like a plea. As if someone trapped deep inside the machinery of unconsciousness had reached out. Not for life, but for recognition. Medicine doesn't prepare you for that kind of moment. We're taught to diagnose, to calculate, to act. Not to question the boundary between the body and whatever it is that looks back from within it. Sometimes I tell myself it was an error, a coincidence of sound and fear. But then I remember Laura's voice, her trembling words. I still hear it sometimes. The beeping, the voices. The room that never ends. She moved away years ago. Sent me one final message before she did. I've read it so many times I can recite it from memory. "If I ever have surgery again," she wrote, "please don't let them put me under." I don't think I ever really woke up. Those words have haunted me ever since. I no longer chase explanations. I don't need to prove what happened to anyone. The truth, I think, isn't something we'll find in charts or monitors. It exists in that unmeasurable space between breath and silence, where awareness lingers like smoke, unseen but never gone. I used to say my job was to take away pain, to give people peace while we fixed their broken bodies. But I've come to realize something far more unsettling. We don't take away consciousness. We just dim the lights and hope it waits quietly in the dark. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear it breathing. We aren't putting people to sleep. We're putting them somewhere else.